While our participants are joining, I just want to welcome everyone to our second session in the College of the Holy Cross 1620-2020 speaker series. We have a total of 4 sessions. We already did our first one a week ago, and that was a fantastic event with Thomas Doughton and Morgan Freeman talking about some of the visual culture of Indigenous peoples in the United States, as well as stereotypes in the visual cultures of settler productions. Today we have Wampanoag Life Before the Pilgrims, which I'll tell you a little more about as people come in. Next week we have another session with 2 historians, and they're going to be talking about statues and monuments of Massasoit. And then our last session is on a Saturday, where we will be screening a film called Pacachog Hill, which we've been putting together to kind of capture and trace the Indigenous history of our college campus. So welcome everyone. We're so happy that you could join us today. Our speaker series explores past and contemporary relations between Native American and settler peoples in what is currently known as New England. This series looks at historic and ongoing Indigenous presence in conjunction with the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the Mayflower in Plymouth, Massachusetts. As I was just explaining, this is our second event in the series. The title of the event is Wampanoag Life Before the Pilgrims. We are very lucky to be joined by 2 scholars to speak with us today on this topic. They will both be speaking for about 15 minutes, and then we will have lots of opportunities for question and answer. So I do want to show all of the participants that at the bottom of your screen, you should have a Q&A function, and anything that you type into that Q&A, we will see, and we will do our best to bring that forward for our speakers. So without further ado, let me introduce our 2 speakers. Kelly Wiskup is joining us. She is a scholar of Native American literatures, early American literatures, and science and literature in the Atlantic world. At Northwestern University, she is an associate professor of English, an affiliate of the Center for Native American and Indigenous Research, and she coordinates the Native American and Indigenous Studies minor. She is the author of Medical Encounters, Knowledge and Identity in Early American Literatures, and recently with Lisa Brooks, she is editing a volume for Library of America on Plymouth Colony and Wampanoag homelands that's coming out very soon by the end of 2020. Second, we'll be hearing from Linda Coombs. Linda Coombs is an independent scholar and historian from the Wampanoag tribe of Gayhead, Aquinnah. She is the former program director of the Aquinnah Cultural Center. Born and raised in Martha's Vineyard, Linda worked for nearly 3 decades with the Wampanoag Indigenous Program at Plymouth Plantation, including 15 years as the program's associate director. Her children's book, Powwow, chronicles the experiences of a Native American girl at her first powwow. Additionally, through her work at Plymouth Plantation, Linda has written a number of essays documenting colonial history from a Native American perspective. I'm realizing I should tell you briefly who I am. I'm Sarah Klotz, Assistant Professor of English at Holy Cross. And without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Kelly for her talk. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Sarah, both for the invitation and the chance to be in conversation with all of you and with Linda. Sarah and I were just reminiscing about the fact that we met in Worcester 6 or 7 years ago at a seminar on Indigenous histories of the book at the American Antiquarian Society. So even though I am not physically with you, I'm in Chicago, it's good to kind of virtually return to Worcester. I'm gonna quickly share my screen because I just have a few slides to share with you, and then I'll get going. So today I wanna raise with you a series of questions about reading critically and in ways that center Wampanoag life in what's often called the colonial archive. These are the books and the manuscripts written by colonists, in this case for our purposes today, about Wampanoag life and people and homelands, and also the physical places the libraries, the archives, the museums where these documents are held. And I have this image of the AAS in hopes that it's familiar to some of you in the audience today. Many settlers across time have seen the Colonial Archive as a source for stories about Patuxet, or the place that English colonists renamed Plymouth. And this archive has also defined the questions that settlers ask about Patuxet and the questions that they bring to narratives about Wampanoag homelands and life before Plymouth. The Colonial Archive is a place of memory and of narratives that in some cases were shaped by Indigenous people. And it's also a site where settlers have sought to preserve and stabilize their own stories about Patuxet and Plymouth. So today I want to ask about how some of the materials in the Colonial Archive might help us to understand some of the information that English and Wampanoag people were gathering about each other before and just after English settlement at Patuxet. And I think asking this question requires us to think critically about how we read early colonial sources, texts written by colonists, including at times carefully reading against the claims that those sources make. And I think this is especially crucial in the case of narratives of Plymouth, which I'm sure, as you know, US historians and commentators often read as marking an origin for the United States, despite the fact that this is an entity, a nation that did not exist in 1620, much less the 17th century, and for narratives of the United States as a place of freedom and democracy, claims that erase Wampanoag homelands and people who lived in Patuxet before Europeans arrived and continue to live there today. So taking up these reading practices means, I think, asking both how colonial sources are oriented by European writers' desires and their need to impress their funders, and also asking what we might be able to learn from those sources about Wampanoag homelands and life by reading them alongside the research of Indigenous intellectuals and knowledge keepers. The Colonial Archive is necessarily incomplete without this consideration of Wampanoag knowledge, narratives, and histories of the 17th century, of times earlier and times beyond. And I want to just say that this is something that I often talk about with my own students. As a non-native settler scholar, I see one of my responsibilities in my classroom as that of asking questions and helping my students think through what is and isn't present in colonial archives, of asking them and of participating with them in the practice of unlearning much of what traditional Western education teaches us about Patuxet, and also of introducing my students to the Indigenous writers who are reframing that archive and those stories and who are keeping Indigenous narratives alive. So that's just to tell you a little bit about how I approach these questions. And just one example of the ways in which Wampanoag stories are continuing to inform how people are thinking about 1620 and 2020. The Our Story exhibit created by Wampanoag people, and I know Linda's been involved in this project, is one way that Wampanoag people today are pushing back against 1620 as an origin point, and also as a story that's primarily and only about the so-called Pilgrims or Plymouth colonists. So I've got the website at the bottom of the slide, and I hope you'll check it out. There's great videos, and there's a traveling exhibit, and lots of opportunities to engage it virtually. So in what follows in the rest of this very short talk, I'll quickly sketch some of the frameworks and contexts that I found helpful for reading the Colonial Archive critically, and then I'll turn to two texts that represent Wampanoag homelands and people before 1620 to try to think with you about some of the ways we might read them critically to see how those texts are shaped by Indigenous people and their lives. So there are two main contexts that I am kind of thinking about as shaping my thinking about colonial archives. And one is the work that Sarah mentioned to edit a collection of primary texts, mostly but not entirely written by colonists, that the Library of America is publishing sometime in 2020 as part of the whole commemoration of the 400th anniversary of the colonist settlement at Plymouth. I did this work with Lisa Brooks, and one of the key challenges we faced was around how to write introductory notes for texts written by colonists that would help readers approach those texts critically. So rather than simply accepting what those narratives said as factual and authoritative, we tried to place the text in a larger context of Indigenous diplomacy and Indigenous homelands, and of English thinking about colonialism, a project that at that point was very, very unfinished and incomplete. A second context for me was work I did about 6 or 7 years ago to edit a edition of Edward Winslow's Good News from New England. So this is a text that is first published in 1624. It is one of the earliest accounts of the Plymouth colonist settlement. And this text is interesting to me because Winslow often acted as Plymouth's diplomat to Osamequin, the leader of the Wampanoags at Pokanoket. And so Winslow spends more time than a lot of other Plymouth colonists with Wampanoag people. He eats food that they share with him. He spends the night in their houses. He tries to follow Wampanoag protocols by visiting Osamequin when he falls ill. And in many, but not all cases, Winslow tries to understand and to follow Wampanoag diplomatic practices, recognizing at least momentarily that Plymouth cannot enforce English ways at Patuxet. Winslow's text is published in 2 editions, and I've got them here for you. This is the first edition here on the left, and the second one here on the right. And so one of the things that I think is super interesting, and sorry, I'll go back into this slide here. One of the things that's really interesting and important about these 2 texts is what Winslow adds to the second one. So you'll see with the arrow here at the bottom that he adds a note about a brief relation of the present estate of Virginia. And what Winslow's referring to there is a story about an attack by allied Powhatan communities in Virginia on Jamestown colonists, an event that happened in 1622. What Winslow's doing is thinking about that action in relationship to the Pilgrims' own attack on Massachusetts people in 1623, in which they kill 7 Massachusetts men based on rumors and fears that the Massachusetts were going to attack Plymouth. So one of the things we see is Winslow reshaping how his text looks in order to try to frame English colonial violence, not as necessarily a response to rumor and fear, but as something that's already framed by pre-existing Indigenous violence, even though that violence is happening hundreds of miles away in Virginia. Winslow's text is not published again until the 19th century, and when it is, it's published in 1841 by a minister named Alexander Young, who starts collecting texts written by the Pilgrims. And Young does something super interesting. He takes Winslow's account of the violence in Virginia and moves it from the end of the text where Winslow had placed it to the very beginning of the text. So that now readers' understanding of Winslow's text and of what happens in Plymouth is shaped by this early account, or this now moved account, of colonial violence in Virginia. And so one of the things that working with Winslow's text helped me to understand and really see in a concrete way is the ways that colonial narratives and the colonial archive is far from stable or set in stone, but that colonial writers and US editors and archivists actively shaped and reshaped that archive in order to tell a particular story about the past. And we can see the way that plays out in publications. So for me, asking about these processes of publication and preservation that defined some colonial narratives as being especially important, you can think here about Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation. This process shows that stories about Plymouth are not uncontested, that they're in flux, and that they're subject to change as people edit and reproduce them to serve their interests at a particular moment. So having kind of outlined my kind of thinking about critical readings of the colonial archive, I want to turn now in the last part of this talk to think through how this critical reading might help us approach some sources that describe Wampanoag homelands and people before 1620, and also to try to expand our sense of what the archive of stories about the Northeast before 1620 might be. So the first text is one that's published in 1616. It's John Smith's Map of New England. Smith sails along the coast of what he named New England in 1614. He did not travel inland. He kind of sailed along the coast doing kind of some surveying and surveillance. He is describing a well-populated place, and a place that he says is actually so well-populated. There are so many indigenous peoples there that he says the English should probably not try to establish a colony there. He doesn't recommend it. Smith is traveling with an Abenaki man whose name he gives as Donahida. And Donahida provides some information to Smith. He gives place names, a sense of political alliances, and some sense of the geography. And so while Smith's map replaces indigenous place names in many cases with English names, this word list from Smith's narrative shows us that he is also learning indigenous place names as they are known to Donahida. So he is both erasing those names, but also recording them and learning them at the same time. Smith misses a lot of information. There's a lot of things he doesn't understand as he's describing Wampanoag homelands, but he also tells us something about the people who are there. And he says of a place he calls the country of the Massachusetts, so this would be next to Patuxet. He says this is the paradise of all those parts, a place with many gardens, fields, and what he calls great troops of people who defended their homelands. So on the one hand, we can see how Smith's map and description reflect English desires for the Northeast, but they also reflect what Smith is seeing of an indigenous place and homelands that are cultivated lands, that are places with political alliances and conflicts, and importantly, ones that Smith suggests English settlers avoid and stay away from. Smith's travels with Donahida point as well to the fact that indigenous people are also traveling the Atlantic. It's not just that Europeans are coming to native lands. Many of the indigenous people taken to England were taken under duress. Donahida and at least 4 other Abenaki men were taken captive in 1605. In 1611, the English captain Edward Harlow took captive about 20 to 30 Wampanoag people from Martha's Vineyard. And this is an account that gives the story of that captivity. In 1614, an associate of Smith's named Thomas Hunt took captive a Patuxet man named Tisquantum and 20 other Wampanoag people. And you've probably heard Tisquantum's story. He's often better known as Squanto. And he makes his way to England after he's taken to Spain to be sold into slavery. And his travels follow what by then was becoming something of a pattern. Tisquantum is taken to the home of an Englishman who supports colonial ventures. He learns some English, and it's the hope of English investors that Tisquantum would provide them with information that would be necessary to settle in Tisquantum's homelands. But Tisquantum also manages to find his way back to his homelands, and he becomes an interpreter at the direction of Osamequin for Winslow and other colonists. So I just want to note that Tisquantum's kidnapping and that of other Wampanoag men and youth in the 1610s shaped the stories that Wampanoag people kept about English people and the decisions that they made about how to interact with Plymouth colonists. Edward Winslow reported that these kidnappings troubled the Pilgrims' attempts to establish diplomatic relations with Wampanoag people. And so Winslow reports in 1622 that the colonists met a Wampanoag mother, and Winslow says she could not behold us without breaking forth into great passion, weeping and crying, Winslow says, excessively, at the memory of losing her 3 sons to this kidnapping. So I think this moment is a really important one to dwell on as a moment in a colonial text, but a moment that tells us that there is a lasting memory of English violence and the loss of family members, that points to the presence of Wampanoag memories that appear and kind of glimmer in this text by Winslow, but also that precede and continue past colonist settlement at Plymouth. And for me, this is a moment that points to a need to question those colonial narratives and the claims they make about the Americas, and to read those narratives alongside Indigenous experiences and histories. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Linda, who I know is going to talk much more about those experiences.
Well, good evening, everyone. I am going to start by telling you about Wampanoag life prior to settlement. And before I do that, just a little bit about how I've come to learn, this knowledge and information. I first learned about this when I was working at Plymouth Plantation in the Wampanoag program. And for everything that we put into the exhibit, we, looked at all the colonial texts that Kelly was just talking about. We, consulted secondary sources, which are those written by people who have read the primary sources and then wrote more things. We looked at information about other tribes or talked with people about other tribes that have a similar culture or live in a similar physical environment to us here in Cape and Plymouth area. And also by doing what I call field research, okay? And by that, I mean, for instance, if it comes to the topic of weaving, Edward Winslow or William Bradford, they didn't put out the how-to instruction for how we did weaving in the 17th century. And it's not something that's come down. It lasted into the 19th century or early 20th century, and then kind of stopped, as far as I know, anyway, within our present day cultures. So we know the type of weaving and we know the style, and we just began to work with it and make things and then refine that process over time. So we had people learning all sorts of material culture things like the weaving or pottery or stoneworking, wood carving, house building, gardens, clothing, cooking, all of it. And now it's been more than 40 years and we have, built up or rebuilt, reclaimed our material culture via that process. But to give you a brief description of what our life was like in the 17th century prior to settlement or, contact, or particularly with the epidemic of 1616, the Wampanoag people had 69 villages, of which Patuxet was one, Mashpee was one, Aquina was one, Manomet, or what's now called the Herring Pond tribe in South Plymouth. These were all, some of those 69 villages. And each village had within its area several sites where they would build the winter villages. The houses were long houses built of cedar saplings and covered with bark, and those buildings would last for approximately 10 years. And when the buildings began to be needed to be rebuilt, people would move to a second site the following winters, okay? In the summertime, people moved out by individual family, and each family of 6 or 8 people would plant between 1 and 2 acres of corn, beans, squash, pumpkins, melons, and sunflowers. And a lot of times people think we were migratory, but we were not. We moved to the coast or to the shore or to riverbanks for planting, where the bottomlands are, your best soil, and went inland, excuse me, maybe a mile, not 700 miles, but just a mile, to get away from the winds that came off the ocean for the winter. We had, the summer cultivating, gathering of wild food plants, fishing. There was a lot of fishing done in the summertime. There were birds hunted in the shoulder seasons. Deer and other game were hunted in the winter. So we had a year-round food supply, okay? And we managed our landscape so that it worked for us, and we, we helped it. And this lifestyle has often been conveyed as primitive or backward, random, scattered, happenstance, undefined boundaries, this sort of thing, very simple or simplistic. And none of this was the case. I used to have people come into the Weechu or the house at the plantation, and the summer house would be covered with mats made of cattail. And people would assume that the cattail mats would not keep the rain out. And so they would say to us, "What do you do when it rains?" And we'd say, "We'd come in the house here," because the whole purpose of these cattail mats was to keep out the rain. And the reason those reeds were used was because of, their physical construction as a reed, and the way that we made the mats. And this is a technology, okay, that Wampanoag and other Native people had for thousands of years. And my thinking came to be that if we lived like this for 10,000, 12,000, 14,000 years, we lived here at least since the time of the glaciers recession, that's plenty of time to figure out how to get in out of the rain. And this is something that we are not given credit for, because there was such a push to describe our life as primitive, okay, and all of this sort of thing. Our life, in fact, was very structured, and it was structured for a very purposeful reason, okay? When we hunted only at certain times, so we weren't hunting when the animals were bearing their young. We knew the woods and the waters so well that we had a huge, immense abundance of food. And even in the early in the 20th century, I've read stories by elders, or interviews, I should say, where they talk about if you were hungry and Gay Head, it's because you didn't know what you were doing. Okay, because people still hunted and fished and all of that, and that's how people survived with gardens. And as I was saying, we managed the landscape in a way that benefited it and didn't deplete it. Okay, it was all about, living in balance, living according to our original instructions, which are, in my mind, fairly simple. The Creator made the world, and he gave everything in creation a certain job to do. So bears had to be bears, oak trees had to be oak trees. Humans had the job of keeping everything as it was created. And as you can probably guess, we haven't done such a great job. And I think up until this time of contact in the 17th century, we were doing that. Because we heard a description of Smith that Kelly gave of this lush landscape that the English and the other Europeans were coming into. And that was not a random occurrence. I mean, we lived like that on purpose to keep the land like that. Because if the land is like that, we will always have food, okay? And rather than being primitive and backwards, and, we had defined territories between nations, between villages, within a village. As I said, there were certain areas where people spent the winter, certain areas where they went and planted the cornfields and everything, other areas where people hunted or fished or gathered blueberries. There was like a place for everything. And sometimes these places were shared by families or villages. It just depended on the landscape itself. And so there was nothing, happenstance or random about it. But that is something that needs to be looked at as well, because the reasons why it was portrayed as being primitive and backward, there were very distinct reasons for portraying it like that, which was to justify the taking of the land. Because if the people are primitive, and the English accuse us of not using the land, not manuring it properly, and all this sort of thing, and it doesn't seem like they really took the time to listen, or if they did, they didn't understand, or they didn't want to understand, and they developed justifications to take it, the land itself, or the timber, or the furs, or what have you. So, all of this activity totally disrupted, our way of life. But I think that, nowadays I see a lot of Indigenous people writing about native science, how people knew the plants, knew the woods, knew the waters, and the knowledge that they had was vast. I can remember when I was 25 and just starting my career in museums, I had the thought that I wanted to learn everything that my ancestors knew. And how naive was I? Because now, almost 50 years later, I certainly have an understanding of the depth and the span of knowledge that they had, the insights that they had, the relationship they had with the earth, and everything that taught them. But I also realized that out of their literal knowledge, I've learned that much. You see that? Just so let me make that smaller. It's about that much. Because recently, this past winter, I had the opportunity to work with the Wellfleet Historical Society on an exhibit that they were putting up for 2020. And during the process of that, I learned about a woman named Delilah Sampson Gibbs, who died approximately 1840. Okay, and Cape Cod, was very was very different then than it is now, and I don't know how much different it was in 1840 from what it was, say, in 1620. Somewhat different, but maybe the smaller gap than what there is between then and today. But Delilah Gibbs either worked for and was friends with a white family in Wellfleet, and there was a woman who developed breast cancer in like 1820. And Delilah not only had the knowledge, but the environment afforded it still as well, was able to go out into the woods and gather different herbs, which she made poultices and treated this woman's breast cancer and cured her. Okay, so that tells me a lot of things. That, a lot of times people think, okay, the Mayflower pulled up, they had Thanksgiving dinner, first Thanksgiving, and then after that, the Indians go away, never to be heard of again. Or, we, at that moment, forget everything of our traditional culture and just assimilate it into English culture, or what was then English culture. And that, was certainly not a clear-cut process at all, and still is not. Because for Delilah to be able to hold on to that knowledge to the extent where she could, treat this woman of such a disease and cure her is miraculous. Okay. So I think that's some things to keep in mind. Delilah was also reported to be the last Indian of Wellfleet. Every town has one. And it just reminds me of the obituary I read one time of, I can't remember who the native person was, but they had passed away and was reported to be the last Indian of whatever the town was, but she was survived by her 6 children. So right there, you can see there's a lot of error, a lot of things that need to be considered before they're believed. And that's it. I'll wait for some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you. I think that gives us so much food for thought. I do want to encourage the participants to begin entering questions into the Q&A function that you see at the bottom of your screen. I have a couple of questions that I would like to ask to get us going. And the first one is to really draw on something that Linda has just said, which is that the Wampanoag history of this region goes back 12,000 to 14,000 years. And so I find it really interesting that we're in this commemorative moment of a 400-year history. And which, as Kelly pointed out, even the United States certainly does not go back to 1620. So I'm wondering if both of you would speak to this idea of what are we commemorating? What is the scale of time that is significant? And where does this impulse come from to say that these 400 years are so important? And really, how can we reframe the discussion around that 14,000 year time period?
I think that the commemoration, certainly, it's done like every 50 years, and the centennial years seem to hold more significance. But I have to, question what the commemoration or celebration, as it was called in the past, I guess I don't understand how people can look at us, in this case, Indigenous people, and just regard us as not as important as the Pilgrims. Okay. And I think, again, that is something that really needs to be rethought. Because there's a lot of talk about equality, but when you get right down to it, there's not a lot of equality for a lot of reasons. If someone thinks that I come from a culture that's backward and primitive, they're saying that their culture is superior. So your equality's gone right there with that one little simple thing, And I think people don't think about that. They think, oh, the Pilgrims landed and America started, and isn't it wonderful? And the Mayflower and I mean, since I've been on the board of Plymouth 400, I've met some Mayflower descendants, and and they trace their family back. They have the same name as their ancestor that came on the Mayflower, and they're very proud of that, being the 10th or 11th generation of this family, and that's fine. I think that people should know that information about who they are and where they came from. But that it doesn't have to be to the exclusion or the overpowering of anyone else, because in Native societies, a lot of times, you introduce yourself, maybe not even with your name first, but your clan or your community and what have you, and that tells people what people you're from and where you come from in the world. Okay. And it's just that. It's not meant to state that because my people did this, they're better than yours, which is sort of what's implied with this this genealogy and lineage thing. Which, I mean, that's a negative aspect of that whole process of tracking your lineage. So I don't know if you want to add to that, Kelly. And
yeah, sure. I'm thinking about the kind of moment after the United States formation in the late 18th century when historians and politicians decided that they needed to create a history for the new United States. And they decided that that could not be an Indigenous history, right? There was already a history for the continent that, as you pointed out, Linda, is 12 to 14,000 years old, very old, but they decided that they had to make a new history. And so the Plymouth colonists' narratives, many of which by that point had been kind of newly rediscovered or would over the course of the 19th century be newly rediscovered, became important to that work of creating that history. And I think about Jeannie O'Brien's title of her book and phrase, Firsting and Lasting. I think she's an upcoming speaker or past speaker. So she's an Ojibwe historian who's written about the Northeast and describes the moves that colonial historians are making in the late 18th, early 19th century as both claiming a firstiness for European colonists and claiming that they are the only society or culture that will last. So there, and in both cases, there's a kind of displacement of Indigenous histories and people. And I always find that the firsting lasting a kind of useful way to think about this. But Linda, I love the ways that thinking about Indigenous science and Native science
Yeah.
really just explodes the timelines from 400 years, which seems so long, to like, no, much, much longer timelines.
Yeah. And I think, you know, one thing that really disturbs me, speaking of landscape, is, you know, I often wonder what it looked like when just my ancestors were here. And, you know, and where the villages were and why they were in those places, where the gardens were and why they were there, and what all the landscape looked like. Because people had roadways that they'd been, or pathways, if you will, Indian trails, you know, whatever the right term is, that they'd been using for thousands of years and were well worn. And these winter villages were sort of like the, you know, center of town type of thing. And I just wonder what that looked like, because other areas were left as ceremonial areas for particular reasons, which you can identify physically, I think. And, you know, and that's been disturbed. I was just hearing something, oh, I don't know if it was at our conference. I can't even remember, and I can't remember who said it, but they were talking about how colonial people built their houses on the site of native cornfields. So if there's a house there, you sort of can't really plant there anymore, you know. And then it makes me think of, and that was purposefully done. That's what I think of. I need to do some work to actually, you know, substantiate that. But then I think of other scholars or authors who, you know, there were some that believe that we did not grow corn because there's no evidence of it archaeologically here on the coast, which isn't true. And, you know, in this new piece of, you know, if you're building houses and you're digging up, maybe there's a cellar and you've destroyed anything, you know. And so, you know, I gave a talk myself once about, you know, that sort of thing. And I was like, there's a whole ton of stuff about corn and beans and squash and fish and fertilizer and dirt and hose and everything else, you know, in our language. And in my mind, that's, you know, no pun intended, that's the last word. You kind of can't refute it if people have been talking about it. They're not going to talk about something for thousands of years. They haven't been doing it. You know, then we're just getting silly, you know. So yeah, there's like layers of stuff to peel away and to sift through and look at, you know, more critically, you know, as you were saying.
I think about that in the Midwest too. I'll be quick, Sarah, sorry, which is also a space shaped by glaciers. And also has an indigenous history that goes back all the way to the receding of the glaciers. And I think about what deforestation has done to the region, and also the ways that farmers leveled earthworks or mounds in order to build their houses or fields. And so just, you know, Chicago is a really flat city, but I also think about all the kind of things that have been erased through deforestation and the kind of leveling for agriculture and the making of, to make the land supposedly more productive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Creator didn't do a good enough job, so.
We got to flatten it out and make it better. Yeah.
I'll ask one more connecting question, and then I'll turn to some of our audience questions. But I was really interested how both of you touched on this idea of colonial narratives, how they change, and what their purpose is. And so, Linda, you were speaking about this notion of primitivism. It's really interesting because the John Smith document that Kelly brings up, he doesn't see a primitive society. He sees a thriving society. And he says the British should not really come here because they're going to have some issues, right? But then this colonial narrative changes.
Right.
And the idea is the land is not being used correctly, or there's no presence of indigenous people at all as these narratives kind of develop. So I'm wondering if you would just touch on what colonial narratives persist with us, and what is the function of these shifting yet persistent narratives about primitivism or absence
Mhm.
of Native people.
Oh, when I was at Plymouth, and since, I mean, I refer to Plymouth because, I mean, you're out there for 8 hours a day answering people's questions, so it's a little more concentrated than otherwise. But, you know, one of the prevailing thoughts was that it was fine for the Pilgrims to come and settle in Patuxet because all the Indians were dead. They'd been wiped out by disease. And it's like, you know, well, yeah, but Patuxet wasn't didn't live in a bubble. It was part of a larger nation of which still had people. And so therefore that would, you know, not make it okay for other people to just come in and start building houses and set up housekeeping, you know, and all the other attendant activities that went with that. And so there's that, and that's that random scattered.
Mm.
We always hear there's, you know, Indians had lived in the scattered villages, and they weren't scattered in the sense of just throw it to the wind and let it blow, you know, but they were purposely placed for, you know, I believe for certain reasons. I'm still kind of working on that one, you know, but I don't think that the village sites were random either. You know, it depended on the number of people and what was in the landscape and how it could be used and taken care of and all the rest of it. So.
And I'll just give an example that builds on Linda's examples of some of the stereotypes around primitivism and a kind of that Indigenous people are backwards. So one of the things I think about being in Chicago, but this is all over the US, is mascots. And so the ways that mascots of Indigenous people sort of represent or portray a stereotype. So here the hockey team is the Blackhawks, and the symbol is the head of that is supposed to represent the man Black Hawk, who is a Sauk leader in the 1820s and 30s. So we have the stereotype that then works to do this erasure of all of this actual history. So there's a kind of like circulation, people buy the stereotype, people believe it's important, they get invested in it, and just thinking about the kind of work that stereotype does to erase a much deeper, much richer, much more complex history, and also to justify, as Linda's pointing to, land theft and settlement and dispossession, kind of all in the same move. If we don't actually learn the history of Black Hawk and the way that he defended his people from US soldiers who are trying to remove them and taking their lands, then settlers don't have to feel guilt over the fact that we are living on Indigenous lands taken by force and with injustice.
Well, and I think that those stereotypes justify taking land or whatever because people are too dumb. Because if you're like the you know, the Redskins guy with the big grin and, you know, and too dumb to take care of yourself. And because that's the other thing, is that our way of life was construed as we lived like that because we didn't know any better way, which is ridiculous. You know, it's laughably ridiculous. And I had a woman years and years ago, thankfully, who came through the plantation and was like, well, what did they do for food? Hunt wild pumpkins? You know, but we were the ones that are, you know, stupid, you know, and it's like, well, actually, you know, pumpkins are cultivated plant, and no, it was a little more structured than that. And, you know, so, you know, those stereotypes, you know, do a lot of damage and serve a lot of justifying purposes at the same time.
Yeah, European beliefs and practices get to be presented as sort of rescuing Indigenous people from not knowing any better. So thank goodness that the Pilgrims brought, you know, the Bible and their ideas about gender relations and fencing in fields and animals, So all those things are construed as like a help or a good,
Yeah.
right? As they're doing this kind of replacement work.
Yeah. I mean, people would ask us, but hasn't your life improved since the Pilgrims arrived?
Yeah.
And that was a real easy short answer. No, but I think that the attitudes that would or the belief system that would encourage questions or produce questions like that, or the hunting wild pumpkins thing and all of that, I think that's been incorporated into the educational system, into the media and the movies and the books and all the rest of it, and come down now over generations, and to where people think that this is fact. Yeah. And they don't, they're in a place where they just don't question it, because this is what they knew growing up, and so that's something that has to be shaken loose and replaced. Yeah. Which is what we're trying to do here, actually. So
yeah.
I really appreciate both of you pointing out the mascot as a very kind of concrete example of how these stereotypes persist, and also the work that they are doing. And I think it's fascinating that you both kind of touch on the mascot of the football team in Washington, D.C., for example, recreating the story of ridiculousness or primitiveness. And then Kelly, you said then those fans get invested in that image, and they get invested in it over time since childhood. And it's a way of kind of maintaining something that I think we would otherwise be able to say that's wrong, to perpetuate a stereotype. If you have that emotional investment because it's your football team, all of a sudden we're fighting a different battle, right? to get that stereotype to kind of leave and go away. We have so many questions about Wampanoag technologies, so I kind of want to turn to the Q&A because a lot of people are really interested in this. So this question is from Daisy Fraybell, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, Daisy. She says, are there ways the Wampanoag and other nations are reclaiming their scientific knowledge, similar to how Linda described reclaiming material skills? I know Western science is constantly revealed to be catching up with previously established indigenous knowledge, like the way we're thinking about fire science in the West. Are there known areas that Native knowledge holders are just waiting to be listened to on, or strategies for reacquiring what has been lost to cultural interruption?
Oh, short answer is yes. And I think that this is sort of this traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, is how it's generally known right now. And that's an area that I feel like I think I've learned a lot of things over the years, but to focus it in as a TEK thing is a new process for me, because it's a never-ending process. It's always turning up something new that you didn't realize before. But I know that a lot of people are doing it for themselves or their own people, or doing learning, relearning, remembering, talking to elders, whatever it takes to rebuild or to just remember this knowledge, and whether you're rebuilding or remembering or just learning, because it's still intact. I think that will vary between one indigenous community and the next. It just depends. But yeah, I think it's it's very healthy. It's ongoing and deep. And I was reading something about how you can read field guides and different books on ecology and science and biology or whatever it is, but if you learn it from or learn it in an indigenous way, you get a whole nother aspect to it, that's very different from what comes through especially if the book is written by a non-native person.
This question is from Melissa Schoenberger, who's my colleague in English. And she says she's very interested in Linda's point about Europeans' failure to learn or disinterest in agricultural technology developed by Indigenous people. It reminds her of Hans Sloane, who's known for founding the British Museum, collected specimens from Native people in the Caribbean, but was largely uninterested in their medical and agricultural knowledge. Could both of you talk a little bit about this maybe museumification of Indigenous knowledge in the West, or also about Wampanoag approaches to farming?
Wampanoag approaches to farming?
Farming.
Okay.
Agriculture.
If we're talking about Indigenous people in the Caribbean, who were some of the first to see Europeans with Columbus and whomever, then we're talking about the doctrine of discovery, okay, which is a series of declarations that came out of the Vatican in the mid-15th century. And the doctrine of discovery, states that Christian people could go into the lands of non-Christians and take their land, enslave the people, kill the people, take all the resources of the land, because non-Christians aren't really human anyway. So, and I think, that is one place where all of this backward primitive stuff comes from, is right there. And so therefore, if you're backward and primitive, you don't have any science or farming knowledge. You're just lucky if your plant grows when you throw the seed in the ground or whatever, And I think that's where it all stems from, and there are a number of scholars. We've had a couple, Mark Charles and Robert Miller, who have discussed the doctrine of discovery and its incorporation into the body of US law. And its implementation from that law, so, there's just a lot of stuff that needs to be looked at thoroughly again.
Can I chime in with a quick follow-up question? Linda, I'm curious about about Plymouth Plantation and whether y'all have been growing corn there for the duration of the program, and if your practices or processes for growing corn at that site have changed over that time.
I think in the early days, I started working there in 75, and we were growing flint corn then. And we got it from a variety of sources, from Iroquois people, or, there's this place down in Rhode Island that was a Narragansett flint corn that was, corn that was as close to what we grew. But then, I guess in the 90s, and not through the Wampanoag program, but through the efforts of Elizabeth Lodge, who was the head of museum programs, at the time. I think she initiated the project where they took, I don't know what they started with, but they bred this corn back, with in conjunction with Cornell. I think it was a program at Cornell University, bred it back to be as close to what we had in the 17th century. And as far as I know, I haven't worked at Plymouth for like 10 years now, but as far as I know, that's the corn that they're still growing. It's a multicolored flint.
That's cool. Thanks.
Yeah, very cool.
Yeah.
Linda, you were just making me think of when I was doing my dissertation research and I had time on my hands to read things that I don't have time to read anymore. I was looking at property law textbooks because I wanted to see the foundation of US property law as it related to tribal law and Native American studies. And what I found in all of these property law textbooks that are being used in law schools right now was that the first precedent of property law, and we know that United States law is always based on precedent going back, the doctrine of discovery is in there. It's in all of these property law textbooks. And I was completely shocked because I don't think anyone would say that that is a legitimate precedent. And yet that is what is being taught in law schools. So it's very much something we should know about and we should be discussing.
Well, I think whether through ignorance or otherwise, stuff just keeps rolling down because, you know, the latest author will read the stuff from the guy before and, you know, and it just keeps rolling. So the critical analysis is absolutely needed.
One more question that we have from the audience. This is from Stephanie Rentz. She says, what do you recommend that we read or experience by Indigenous writers, thinkers, and artists to learn this history?
Well, I think both of Lisa Brooks's books, just off the top of my head, The Common Pot and Our Beloved Kin, and then also an Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, which is, I find, I'm just finishing it now and it's shocking. You know, but I think she does, you know, such an excellent job of describing, you know, the development of the United States and what's really going on. So.
And I might add, just thinking about TEK, Robin Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, which I really love and have returned to recently. And then I was trying to think about things from the Northeast too. I was thinking about the collection Dawnland Voices. It's edited by Siobhan Senior, but it's a great huge anthology of, do you have it, Sarah? Yeah, I had to look at my bookshelf because I have it right here too, of Indigenous writers from the Northeast. Do you have a piece in there, Linda?
Yes.
I think you do, yeah. And she has a digital component as well that's very cool. So I think that's a super one. Maybe I'll add a non-scholarly book. I just read Cheryl Savageau's Out of the Crazy Woods, I think it is, which is a memoir. But I also love her poetry, so Mother/Land. She's an Abenaki poet and writer. I could keep going, but that'll get you started.
Great, thank you. Let's do one more question, and then we will let our fantastic speakers get off of their computers, which I'm sure they are excited to do. This one is for Linda. I'm interested in this one too. Having worked for years at Plymouth, have you noticed a change in questions from children over time? Same with Kelly. Have you noticed a change in your college students' knowledge over time?
I don't know if I can answer that one very well because I worked as an interpreter on the home site, you know, where there were days when we had 2,000 or 3,000 kids coming through and, you know, you're lucky to survive it, never mind answer a question now and then. And I hadn't worked on the site since like the mid 90s. So I hadn't interacted with kids, you know, in that regard. Since then, I've more interacted with teachers. But with, you know, as far as the teachers go, what I have found that within that time period, the last 20, 25 years, is that they are wanting more accurate history, more accurate information. They want to teach the kids the truth about history. And this is, you know, any grade level, kindergarten up through college. And, you know, are very open to hearing a very tough history. and then working, around how you present certain information at certain age levels and this sort of thing. So, yeah, so that's been very gratifying.
Yeah, I think that's true of college students too. And hi, Ashley, it's good to not see you, but be in the same virtual space as you. Um, I think Standing Rock really, for the current generation of college students, was a moment where people did a lot of self-education, sometimes in ways that were problematic, but also in ways that meant that folks knew about environmental issues and issues of land dispossession by places like the US and also by things like oil companies, and the ways in which Indigenous peoples' rights connected up with environmental concerns. And I think, the students I'm teaching now are living in a world that is shaped really fundamentally by climate change. And so I think they're aware of that and also aware of the kinds of stakes of the decisions around Indigenous lands. So I think there's a greater awareness of that and a kind of interest in learning more about that. And I think my students are also, kind of interested in thinking about opportunities, moments of Black and Indigenous solidarity against anti-Blackness and colonialism. And so I think there's a kind of greater knowledge of the kinds of collaborations that can happen and that have happened over time. So, which is all to say, I think our students are really great and I feel really lucky to be in conversation with them these days.
Well, I want to just extend a sincere thank you to both of our speakers for taking the time to join us today and teach us about all the things that you know. I also want to thank our participants for being here, for asking questions. I do want to give a plug for next week's session, same time, same place on Zoom, but we will have different speakers. Kelly talked about Jean O'Brien's book, Firsting and Lasting. Jean O'Brien will be with us with her colleague Lisa Blee. They've written another book, and that's what they'll be talking about next week. So thank you again so much, everyone. Feel free to follow up to me by email if you wish, if you have questions, and we will be posting a recording of this session on the McFarland Center website. And those are our funders, and we're very grateful to them for making this possible. So thank you, everyone, and we hope you have a really nice evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah and Linda. This was really great.